Okay, today is Tuesday, January 15th, and we are going to do Eureka Math Module 3, Lesson 13. And today's learning goal says I can use benchmark numbers to help me decide if my answer is reasonable. Benchmark numbers means numbers that are familiar to you. For example, 10, or 5, or 20, or 100. Have you used benchmark numbers before to help you estimate how big something might be? Yeah. What are some benchmark numbers that might be fractions? Like, what are some fractions that you know the size of in your head that's very common? Tarun? 1. Absolutely. 1 whole. Rashit? 1/2. Very good. And actually, those are the two benchmark numbers we're going to be using today. Before we get into today's lesson, though, let's 1/2 plus 3/4. We're not actually going to solve it right now. I just want you to know, do you think the answer will be greater than 1 or less than 1? And why do you think that? Go ahead and talk at your table groups. My first term here is 1/2. If I wanted to add something to 1/2 to make it exactly 1, what would I have to add to 1/2 in order to make it exactly 1? Shivani? 1/2, right? Something that's equal to 1/2. 1/2 plus 1/2 equals 1. We know that. Now, our second term actually is 3/4. Is 3/4 bigger than 1 or less than 1? Sorry, is 3/4 bigger than 1/2 or less than 1/2? So if I have 1/2 and I add something bigger than 1/2, is my final answer going to be greater than 1 or less than 1? So let's write that it's going to be greater than 1. Let's actually do some math to see if we're actually correct. Now, what would be my least common denominator between 1/2 and 1/4? 4, right? So it'd be 2/4 plus 3/4, which is 5/4, which is 1 and 1/4. Is that greater than 1? So it is true. We can use what we know. Do you see how you can use what you already know about the size of these fractions to see if it'll be bigger or smaller than a benchmark? In this case here, what is our benchmark? 1, because we're trying to see if the answer will be greater than our benchmark of 1 or less than our benchmark of 1. Now we want to find out if 4 3/5 minus 3 3/4 will be greater than or less than 1. Let's think about this for a second. Pretend there was no fractions. If it was just 4 minus 3, that would be 1, right? Okay. Now, what if there was no whole number? If I have 3/5 minus 3/4, which one's bigger? 3/5 or 3/4? 3/4. So if I'm taking something smaller and taking away something bigger, is it going to be more than 1 or less than 1? More than 0 or less than 0? It's going to be a negative number, right? So put all those pieces together. If I have 4 3/5 minus 3 3/4. If I just had 4 3/5 minus 3, what would the answer be? 1 3/5. And then if I have to take away another 3/4, am I going to end up with more than 1 or less than 1? Less than 1. Ah, very good. So you can see, write down that inequality there. 4 3/5 minus 3 3/4 will be less than 1. This one's a little trickier, right, to reason out. Use your own words right now. Pair up in your table groups. Okay, tell one person how you know this will be less than 1 or greater than 1. Now our benchmark number is 1/2. Okay, we want to know if 1/5 plus 1/4 will be greater than 1/2 or less than 1/2. What do we know about 1/2? What's exactly half of half? 1/4. Right? Think about a cake. If I have a cake and I cut it into half, and I cut half into half, how big is 1/2 of a half? 1/4. That means 1/4 plus 1/4 will be 1/2, right? Do we have 1/4 plus 1/4 here? We have 1/5 plus 1/4. So this 1/5 right here, is it bigger or smaller than 1/4? Small. So if I add something smaller than 1/4 to 1/4, will I have 1/2 or will I have less than 1/2? Or more than 1/2? Less than 1/2. Very good. So you can write the inequality 1/5 plus 1/4 will be less than 1/2. So that means that when you're doing math and you have this problem, 1/5 plus 1/4, and if you get the answer 3/4, is that reasonable? No. So you always need to use what you know about benchmark numbers to decide if your answer is reasonable or not. If you end up with something that's greater than 1/2 here, you know that your answer is not reasonable. Does that make sense? Very good. Let's do this one. Our benchmark number is still going to be 1/2. We want to know if 1 and 1/7 minus 5/6 will be greater or less than 1/2. Talk at your table groups to see if you can figure this one out. Imagine for a second the problem didn't start with 1 and 1/7. It just started with 1. What would I need to take away from 1 to make it exactly 1/2? 1/2, right? So because we know that 1 minus 1/2 equals 1/2. Thank you to those of you who are taking it seriously and taking good notes. Now, in our math problem, do we really start with 1? We're starting with 1 and 1/7. Is that something bigger or less than 1? Bigger. So does that mean if I have now 1 and 1/7, what will I need to take away to make it exactly 1/2? Am I going to have to only take away 1/2 or take away more than 1/2? How much more than 1/2 am I going to have to take away? I'm going to have to take away 1/2 plus 1/7, right, in order to make it exactly 1/2. Do you guys see how I thought about that? Talk to your table group. How did I come up with the fact that if I have 1 and 1/7, in order to end up with exactly 1/2, I have to take away the sum of 1/2 plus 1/7? If I know that if I have 1 and 1/7, I'd have to take away 1/2 plus 1/7 in order to get to 1/2 exactly, right? So then we have to figure out, okay, is 5/6 more or less than 1/2 plus 1/7? What do we know about 5/6? It's pretty close to 1. It's only 1/6 away from 1, right? What about 1/2 plus 1/7? Is that going to be bigger or smaller than 5/6? Smaller. So is my final answer going to be 1/2 or more than 1/2? Or less than 1/2? Very good, because this is bigger than this. Okay, good. Without actually solving it, we have to figure out if 2 and 1/3 plus 3 and 1/5 will be bigger or smaller than 6 plus 7/8. Let's use what we know first. Look at the whole numbers. We have 2 plus 3. What's 2 plus 3? 5. Okay. So this is equal to 5. And then our fraction part, 1/3 plus 1/5. Is that going to be, in order to make this side bigger, it's going to have to be more than 1, right? Because it has to be, make our 5 into a 6 plus 7/8. So in order to make this left side smaller than the right, or bigger than the right side, 1/3 plus 1/5 would have to be greater than 1 and 7/8. Is 1/3 plus 1/5 going to be greater than 1 and 7/8? So which side is going to be bigger? 6 plus 7/8. Very good. Go ahead and write this in your notebook. And then please write using words how you know without actually, did we use LCDs or anything like that? Did we add any fractions? Anything like that? No. Explain using words how you know that 2 and 1/3 plus 3 and 1/5 is going to be less than 6 and 7/8.